Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 50 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the greatest journeys of discovery ever undertaken. Adventures that not only opened up new worlds but also reshaped our understanding of nature, culture, and what it means to be human. In the true story I'm currently telling you, we traveled into the South Seas and around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook, seen through the eyes of 17-year-old Georg Forster. Born in 1754 near Gdansk, Georg emigrated to London with his father, the scientist Reinhold Forster, in 1766. In 1772, the British Admiralty invited Reinhold to join Cook's second Pacific voyage and to document it scientifically. Reinhold agreed on one condition. His son Georg would join as a draftsman and scientific assistant. After more than 3 years at sea, they returned with a groundbreaking story to tell. Georg's narrative is not only considered the beginning of modern German travel literature, it also deeply influenced later explorers and ethnologists, including Alexander von Humboldt himself. Forster's reflections revolve around the core of humanity, especially the fascinating ways people live together. So in the coming episodes, let us dive into this literary journey, a voyage that explores both the world and the human spirit. Forster's account is written in the language of his time, but I've translated it into modern English for clarity. His insights reflect the knowledge of late 18th century. So throughout this podcast, I'll provide additional context where needed to help you better understand this extraordinary world. What happened in the last episode? Previously on Voyage to go history, the crew of the Resolution left the island of Namoka, today known as Nomuka in Tonga, and set sail for new lands. They passed the volcanic island of Tofua, where they saw steam rising from the crater and even experienced early acid rain caused by volcanic gases. From there, they continued west and came across a new island which they named Turtle Island, though they weren't able to catch a single turtle. As their journey went on, they entered what we now know as the island group of Vanuatu. On July 18, 1774, they reached Aurora Island, with its lush green forests and waterfalls tumbling into the sea. They sailed past Pentecost and the so-called Island of the Lepers, observing scattered settlements, cultivated land, and dramatic mountain peaks. Along the way, they saw volcanoes releasing steam and coastlines glowing with cooking fires, clear signs of human life and fertile land. Though contact with the islanders was limited, the landscapes were striking and the region was rich with promise. The Resolution was now deep in the South Pacific, and Georg Forster was entering one of the most exciting chapters of the voyage, full of discovery, mystery, and beauty. Tuesday, July 19th, 1774, of the island of Ambrym, Vanuatu.
The forests glowed with vibrant green, and coconut palms were visible everywhere. The mountains lay well inland, creating flat plains between them and the shore, which were covered in forest and bordered by a lovely beach. Around midday, they approached the coast and saw many locals wading in the water up to their hips. 2 of them were armed, one with a spear, the other with a bow and arrows, while the rest carried clubs. Yet despite their warlike appearance, they waved green branches, which are universally recognized as signs of peace. Contrary to expectations, and perhaps their wishes, the sailors had to turn away at that moment, due to the need for maneuvering. After their meal, they finally prepared to land and sent out 2 boats to explore a harbor they had spotted from the ship. At the southern end of this small bay, which was protected by a coral reef, several hundred locals had gathered. Some came out in their canoes to meet the advance boats, but did not dare come close to the ship itself, which still lay far out at sea. Eventually, the men from the boats signaled that there was good anchorage within the bay. Following their guidance, they steered into a narrow harbor flanked by coral reefs at the entrance, which seemed to reach deep into the interior. After that, the pilots returned to the ship, and the officer reported that the locals had come very close to the boat in their canoes, showing not the slightest sign of hostility. Instead, they waved green branches, scooped water from the sea with their hands, and poured it over their heads. Since the officer understood this ceremony to be a sign of peace, he responded in kind, which greatly pleased them. As soon as they entered the bay, the locals approached the ship and waved green branches, especially from the Dracæna terminalis and a beautiful Croton variegatum, all while repeating the word Tomarr or Tomarro over and over again, which was likely equivalent to the Tahitian word tayo, meaning friend. Still, most of them were armed with bows and arrows, some also with spears, and seemed prepared for either war or peace. When they came close enough, the sailors dropped a few pieces of Tahitian cloth down to them, which they eagerly accepted, immediately offering several arrows in return. The first had only wooden tips, but shortly afterward they handed over some with bone tips coated in a black, resin-like substance, which they suspected might be a kind of poison. To find out, they wounded a young Tahitian dog in the thigh with one of the arrows, but no harmful effects followed. The language of these people differed so greatly from all other South Sea dialects known to them that they couldn't understand a single word. It sounded distinctly harsher, as sounds like R, S, ch, and other consonants occurred frequently. In physical appearance, too, these people differed markedly. They were strikingly slender and rarely taller than 1.60 meters, with limbs that seemed out of proportion, arms and legs usually long and very thin. Their skin was dark brown, their hair black and tightly curled. The most distinctive feature, however, was their facial structure. Like people of African descent, they had flat, broad noses and prominent cheekbones, along with a short forehead that was sometimes unusually shaped and flatter than in other well-formed individuals. Some had also painted their faces and chests black, which made their appearance even less attractive. A few wore small caps made of woven mats, but otherwise they were completely naked. A cord was the only thing tied around their waists, so tightly that it left a deep groove. While nearly all other peoples had invented clothing out of a sense of modesty, here the men's genitals were only wrapped in fabric and tied upward to the belt, not truly covered, but exposed in a manner that, by their standards, was shockingly indecent. Since their arrival in the harbor, the islanders had surrounded the ship from all sides, speaking with such liveliness and exuberant chatter that it was a delight to witness. The moment someone was looked at directly, he would immediately start babbling without pause, grinning as well out of friendliness, though the grin looked no better than Milton's death. This, combined with their slender build, unattractive appearance, and dark skin tone, made them appear to the travelers almost like a species of ape. Still, Georg was absolutely unwilling to let Rousseau, or those superficial minds who blindly followed him, draw any support for his orangutan theory from this. On the contrary, he pitied anyone who could so completely forget himself and his intellectual faculties as to lower himself to the level of baboons.
Georg Forster's description of the islanders is a striking example of the European Enlightenment's ambivalence toward the other. He depicts the people's appearance, language, and behavior with the eye of a naturalist, yet also with the prejudices of his time. What stands out is how strongly Georg emphasizes physical difference. Dark skin, woolly hair, flat noses, disproportionate limbs, traits that, in the anthropological thinking of the 18th century, were often associated with devaluation. The comparison to apes, especially in his reference to the orangutan system, is particularly problematic. With this term, Forster alludes to a theory of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, in his notion of the noble savage, idealized humans in the state of nature as morally superior and free from the constraints of civilization. Critics of his view, including Forster, accused Rousseau of romanticizing nature to such an extent that he blurred the line between the human and the animal. By distancing himself so clearly from Rousseau's orang-utan system, Forster also distances himself from any suggestions that the islanders should be equated with animals. He does not condemn the people themselves, but rather those Europeans who, out of misguided enthusiasm, dehumanize themselves and lower themselves to the level of baboons. This sharp phrasing reveals that, for Forster, humanity is defined above all by reason and education. To idealize raw nature, as Rousseau does, is in his eyes to forfeit the true dignity of being human. Forster's perspective thus moves between a colonial gaze and Enlightenment ideals. He observes with curiosity and precision, but also reveals the values and anxieties of his era.
When night fell, the islanders returned to shore and lit numerous fires along the coast. Beside them, they continued to talk loudly with one another as if they couldn't get enough of it. Late in the evening, they came back out to the ship in their boats, this time carrying burning torches, hoping once more to speak with the crew. On their part, there was no lack of words or good spirits, but from aboard, there was hardly anything appropriate to reply. The evening was calm and beautiful. The wind had died down, and the moon occasionally broke through the clouds. When the islanders realized the sailors weren't as talkative as they were, they began offering arrows and other small items for trade. But the captain gave strict orders not to buy anything, in hopes of getting rid of them. It was unusual and new to see islanders still so active on the water this late at night. Some of the men suspected they might only be trying to find out whether the ship was well guarded, though their behavior had given no real reason to believe so. At last, when they realized neither conversation nor trade was wanted, they headed back to shore around midnight, but not to sleep. All night long, one could hear them singing, drumming, and at times dancing. This made it clear how naturally fond they were of joy and festivity. The next morning brought no more rest from the islanders. At the very break of day, they arrived again in their canoes, calling out loudly and repeating the word Tomarr over and over. 4 or 5 of them came aboard without weapons. Once on the ship, they moved about freely and without concern, even climbing with remarkable ease all the way to the highest crow's nest of the standing rigging. When they came back down, the captain invited them into his cabin and presented them with medals, ribbons, nails, and pieces of red cloth. During this exchange, the Europeans came to see them as the most intelligent and perceptive people they had yet met in the South Seas. They grasped signs and gestures so quickly and confidently, it felt as if they had long been acquainted. Within minutes, they taught the sailors a good number of words from their language. As initially suspected, this language was entirely different from the general tongue spoken, though in different dialects, on the Society Islands, the Marquesas, the Friendly Islands, the Low Islands, Easter Island, and in New Zealand. One especially striking sound was a rolling brrr, produced with the lips. One of their friends, for example, was named Ambrym, another bonhomme. When they were surprised by something, they made a hissing sound, similar to the way geese hiss when provoked. They wanted to own everything they saw, but they accepted a refusal without resentment. What delighted them most were small mirrors, in which they studied their own reflections. In this, they perhaps showed even more vanity than the more attractive inhabitants of Tahiti and the Society Islands. They had holes in their earlobes and nasal cartilage, into which they inserted decorative items, either a thin stick or 2 small pieces of white selenite or alabaster tied together in the shape of an obtuse angle. On their upper arms, they wore bracelets made of alternating small black and white shell pieces, intricately woven together. These rings fit so tightly that they must have been placed on in early childhood, as it would now have been impossible to slip them over the elbows. Their skin was soft and smooth, sooty or dark brown in color, and darkened even further on the face by black paint. Their hair was tightly curled and woolly, though not fine in texture. Their beards were thick and also curled, but not woolly. They had no tattoos on their bodies. Besides, with such dark skin, any markings would have been barely visible from a distance. Mr. Hodges took the opportunity to draw various portraits of these people. One of them was later engraved for Captain Cook's official account. The facial features of this nation were captured with great accuracy, though it is unfortunate that a mistake in the drawing made it necessary to depict a drapery over the shoulder. Contrary to their real appearance, as these people wore no clothing whatsoever. They were easily persuaded to sit still when Mr. Hodges wanted to sketch them, and they even seemed to understand what the images were supposed to represent. They were deep in conversation, and the good people appeared thoroughly pleased, when the first lieutenant entered the cabin and reported to the captain that one of the islanders had asked to come aboard, but had been refused because the ship was already crowded. In response, the islander had raised his arrow against the sailor who, from the boat, had pushed his canoe away. Whether the islanders inside the ship guessed the content of this report from the lieutenant's words, or from expressions, or whether they were warned by a single word from their companions outside, in any case, the lieutenant had not yet finished speaking, when one of the islanders suddenly leapt out of the open cabin window and swam toward his angry countryman to calm him down. Meanwhile, the captain went up on deck with a loaded musket and took aim at the islander, who, despite his companion's pleas, continued to aim at the sailor. When the man realized the captain was about to shoot him, he turned his arrow on the captain. At that moment, the islanders gathered around the ship called out to those still in the cabin, and whether out of fear for the consequences of their companion's defiance or for another reason, they each jumped, one after the other, out of the cabin window into the sea, despite all efforts to reassure them. Georg suddenly heard a musket shot and hurried to the deck. The captain had fired a load of buckshot at the man, hitting him with a few pellets. But this did not deter him. Instead, he calmly set aside his arrow, which had only a wooden tip, and reached for another that appeared to be poisoned. As soon as he began aiming again, the third lieutenant fired a second blast of buckshot into his face. This immediately took the fight out of him, and he quickly rowed back to shore. In his place, another islander on that side of the ship fired an arrow at the deck, which lodged in the rigging of the mainmast. A shot was fired in return, but fortunately missed. Now all the canoes began gradually retreating to shore, and the islanders, who were still on board, threw themselves into the sea to escape. One of them, who happened to be up in the crow's nest, and certainly expected nothing of the commotion, came down in a state of sheer panic, descending the mast with incredible speed. To increase their fear and demonstrate firepower, a cannonball was fired over their heads and into the trees on shore, which caused them to flee even faster. Those closest to the ship jumped in terror from their canoes into the water, and all made it back to shore in a state of total confusion. Hardly had they reached land when war drums were heard from various directions, poor fellows running back and forth or huddled in groups beneath the bushes, no doubt to decide what should be done in such a critical moment. Georg and the others, meanwhile, sat down quite calmly to breakfast. Around 9 a.m., a few of the islanders reappeared. They paddled around the ship but remained shy and cautious. The crew waved to them with a branch of Dracaena terminalis, the same plant they themselves had offered the day before as a sign of peace. As soon as the people saw this, they dipped their hands into the sea, placed them on their heads, and came closer to receive gifts the captain handed down from the ship. Afterward, they returned to shore. The travelers followed in 2 boats, carrying the captain, Georg's father, Dr. Sparman, Georg himself, a few others, and a detachment of Marines. About 23 meters from shore ran a reef parallel to the coast, inside of which the water became so shallow that they had to wade the rest of the way to land. There, the Marines formed a line facing at least 300 islanders, who were all armed but behaved in a peaceful and friendly manner. A man of medium age, taller than the others and apparently a leader, handed his bow and quiver to a companion, then stepped forward unarmed and offered the captain his hand as a sign of friendship and reconciliation. He then had a young pig brought and presented it as a gift, perhaps to make amends for his countryman's earlier offense, or perhaps to confirm a peace agreement. This moment was drawn by Mr. Hodges and beautifully engraved in copper for Captain Cook's travel account. After the exchange, the Europeans made it clear that they were in need of firewood. To help with this, the islanders pointed out several trees right on the beach, which the crew then felled and sawed into pieces. The beach at that spot was no wider than about 11 meters, so in the event of an attack, they would have found themselves in a very dangerous position. To offer at least some protection, The captain had a line marked in front of the landing area and made it clear to the islanders that they were not to cross it. They observed this line closely, but their numbers kept increasing from all directions. Every man carried a drawn bow made of dark brown wood, tougher and more beautiful than mahogany. The arrows were kept in round quivers woven from leaves and were made of reed shafts about 60 centimeters long, usually tipped with a 30-centimeter point of ebony or another shiny, black, and brittle wood. Other arrows had shorter tips, just 5 to 7 centimeters long, made of bone fitted into the shaft and bound with coconut fiber. These fibers were wrapped in a crisscross pattern, forming small offset squares that were alternately filled with red, green, and white ochre. The bone tips were extremely sharp and coated with a black, resin-like substance, similar to a varnish. Trusting in the newly established peace agreement, they ventured beyond the marked boundary and mingled freely with the islanders. Due to the locals' natural inclination for conversation, they immediately began talking and allowed themselves to be instructed in the native language. The islanders were amazed at how quickly the foreigners retained the words and spent some time trying to understand how it was possible to capture the sound of spoken language with pencil and paper. Just as eager as the islanders were to teach their language, they were equally curious to learn something of the foreign tongue. They repeated everything they were told with astonishing ease. To further test their pronunciation, the foreigners attempted to teach them difficult sounds from various European languages, such as the complex Russian sh. Yet even this they pronounced correctly on the first try, without difficulty. As soon as Georg recited the names of numbers, they quickly repeated them using their fingers. In short, what they lacked in physical beauty, they more than made up for in sharpness of mind. The visitors wanted to purchase various weapons, but at first the islanders were reluctant to part with any. Their hesitation vanished, however, once they were offered handkerchiefs, pieces of Tahitian cloth, or English wool fabric. In exchange, they soon handed over their usual arrows, and eventually even the poisoned ones, but warned in the strongest terms not to touch the tips. Even the slightest wound, they said, could be deadly. With the other arrows, they explained, one might be shot clean through the arm without being in danger of death. But if anyone tried to touch a poisoned tip despite their warnings, they would gently pull his arm back each time out of genuine concern, as if trying to save him from certain harm.
In Polynesian warfare, arrows played only a minor role compared to spears and clubs. However, in certain regions, poisoned arrowheads were used. This was not a widespread phenomenon across all of Polynesia, but rather a localized practice, shaped by cultural and geographical conditions. Such poisons were particularly employed by smaller, isolated island groups or intense conflict situations as a strategic means to incapacitate or kill enemies without engaging in close combat. The poisons used were mostly derived from plant or animal sources. In some cases, the milky sap of toxic plants or specific fish toxins were applied. Occasionally, poisonous secretions from pufferfish or octopuses were also used. The exact chemical composition of these poisons was unknown to the Polynesians, but through experience, they understood which substances caused paralysis or death. In the Tonga archipelago, the use of arrow poison is only weakly documented. Tonga was known for its highly hierarchical society, complex warfare strategies, and ritualized combat, but clubs and spears were the main weapons. Arrows were primarily used for fishing or in ritual contexts. When arrows were used in warfare, for example by isolated island groups or during ambushes, they were sometimes coated with substances that caused paralysis, inflammation, or pain. Evidence of systematically used deadly arrow poisons in the Tongan region is rare. Accounts by European travelers such as Georg Forster or James Cook mentioned poisoned arrows in isolated cases, or at least suspicions of them. For instance, bone tips coated with a black, sticky substance. Whether these were truly lethal toxins, irritants, or merely symbolic ritual materials often remained unclear. Tests, such as one performed on a young dog, showed no apparent effects. Overall, it can be said that arrow poisons were known in Polynesia, but they were not a widespread or dominant element of warfare. In the Tonga archipelago, they were more the exception than the rule, and mostly embedded in specific cultural or ritual contexts.
In addition to bows and arrows, the men also carried clubs made of casuarina wood, slung over the right shoulder on a thick cord twisted from grass. These weapons, like all their wooden tools, were carefully crafted and smoothly polished, usually knobby at the lower end, but no longer than about 105 centimeters. They were likely used only in close combat, once all arrows had been spent. On their left hand, they wore a round-cut piece of wood, artfully covered with straw, and tied over the knuckles. This small shield, about 12 centimeters in diameter, served to protect the hand from the snap of the bowstring when shooting. This wooden cuff, as Georg called it, along with the few ornaments previously mentioned, the bracelets made of shell, the stone in the nasal cartilage, and the shell worn on the chest, were still too valuable to the islanders at this time to be traded away. Not far from the beach, where their men were felling trees, they found no new plants, but the interior of the island looked even more promising, as it appeared to be one vast forest. Dr. Sparman and Georg discovered a path that allowed them to slip in under the cover of some bushes without being noticed. So they set off and, after just 20 steps, found 2 beautiful new plants. But they had barely secured their botanical find when several locals emerged from the forest and, through repeated gestures, made it clear that they should return to the beach. Georg and the naturalist showed them the plants they had picked and tried their best to explain with signs that they were only looking for herbs. But it made no difference. The people insisted on escorting them out of the forest, and to avoid trouble, they had no choice but to turn back. In this area, the trees were still very dense, interwoven with low thickets. Deeper inland, the forest seemed to open up. Perhaps there was a plantation or a settlement there, as they could hear the voices of women and children. That made it all the more frustrating to have been discovered just then. Under the trees, they found no new species, but among the so-called undergrowth, there seemed to be some kinds still unknown. From the ship, they had already seen coconut palms, banana trees, breadfruit trees, and other valuable plants, and had even learned their names in the local language. During their short absence, the captain had asked the presumed chief for fresh water. Following his instructions, he was immediately given a calabash full of it. The water was very clear and clean, and was presented to him together with a coconut. But no more than this small amount could be obtained, despite repeated requests. Some of the locals wore small bundles of a certain herb on their arms, a plant belonging to the new genus Evodia, with fragrant blossoms. To study the plant more closely, they took some of the bundles from their arms. Some allowed it without resistance, but others snatched the bundles back and threw them away with a dark glance, as if something suspicious or ominous were associated with it. Georg and the naturalist had often tasted the seeds of this plant, found them pleasantly aromatic, and never experienced any negative effects, so the plant could hardly be poisonous or harmful. Why some of the people pulled it back so aggressively remained unclear, unless the herb was considered in their culture to be a sign of hostility or challenge, just as other plants were used as symbols of peace and friendship. Meanwhile, the tide was going out, and the water had receded far enough that they could walk dry-footed out to the reef. There, a large number of locals stood around the boats, ready to trade. The men of the expedition felt somewhat surrounded, and had one part of the Marines take position facing inland, the other toward the sea, even though the islanders showed no signs of hostility. Nevertheless, they continued their conversations without concern, while the islanders spoke just as loudly among themselves, creating a hubbub like that of a busy fairground. But suddenly, this loud murmur fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness. The men looked around in alarm, glancing about anxiously and gathering near the soldiers just in case. The locals, too, seemed confused, and apparently feared that something was about to go wrong. But when they realized that there was no sudden movement among the newcomers, they began talking again, and within minutes the tension had dissolved on both sides. The small incident that triggered this tense silence also revealed how well disposed the people were toward the Europeans. A sailor had asked a local man to shoot an arrow as high into the air as possible. The man agreed at once and was already drawing his bow, but some of his companions urged him not to go through with it, fearing that the shot might be misunderstood. At the same time, they called out to the rest of the group to stay alert. This is how the sudden silence came about, a scene that would have provided rich material for a painter or poet. The tension on every face, wary glances, threatening expressions, eyes gleaming with courage, countless poses and gestures with weapons, the landscape itself, the different groups of islanders, all of it came together to form a vivid historical tableau.
That brings us to the end of episode 50 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.